Hi everybody, I'm Peter Laws and it's good to join you again for your service, although this time not face to face. But I do think during this lockdown I've found personally that these kind of services online can still be a really meaningful expression of church, so thanks for letting me take part. Now you find me today in my house in Ampthill. Sadly I don't have a lake nearby. I would have used that as a backdrop if I had, but I don't. But let me read you a story and you'll know why that would have looked good for this story. It's from Matthew 14, starting at verse 22. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. But the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. And Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come out on the water." "Come," Jesus said. And then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, Peter cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." And when they climbed into the boat, said that bit. And when they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched him were healed. It's a pretty wild story, but let's explore it. Nothing is impossible. Do you believe that? I remember growing up, I used to say that a lot. I wasn't a Christian at the time, but I remember thinking that theoretically everything could be achieved. But I remember saying that to my dad once when I was young. I said, "Dad, I reckon that nothing is impossible." And he looked at me and kind of nodded politely, then said, "Okay, here's a theoretical idea. Could you do this? Would you have been able to go upstairs?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, I could do that." And he said, "Could you open your window?" "Yeah, I can do that." He said, "Could you stick your bottom out of the window?" And I went, "Yes, of course I could do that." He says, "Right, then after that, could you run downstairs and then run into the front garden and find a brick?" I'm like, "Yeah." And he says, "And then could you throw that brick as hard as you could at your bottom, sticking out of the window?" And I was like, "What?" And it was so absurd. We burst out laughing, but I actually thought it was a brilliant example of something that seems utterly beyond the realms of logic and physics for someone to stick their bum out of the window, run down and throw a brick at it. And I thought, you know what, maybe there are things that are impossible in life. Until that is, I became a Christian and I started to explore two things. Firstly, I discovered that Jesus was a man who could bend the laws of chemistry and physics. But interestingly, around that time, I was hearing strange things from science, from a field called quantum physics, where sometimes the natural world doesn't act in the way we might expect. And I started to think, who knows, maybe even the impossible could be possible under the right circumstances, particularly with this Jesus character around. We see a vivid example of this in our passage where Jesus presents a teaching moment to his disciples. He's always doing this, Jesus. He wants his followers to raise their level of consciousness, right? To open their mind to new possibilities. And in this passage, he does something that knocks this up a gear for them, this learning experience. Perhaps that's why at the very start of the passage, he goes to spend some time on his own. Did you spot that? He spends some time on a mountainside to pray, and I wonder if Jesus is praying specifically for his disciples to prepare them for the mind-blowing teaching moment they are about to experience. So this moment of teaching comes at 4 a.m. in the morning, where the disciples are out on the lake, which is to say the Sea of Galilee, and a strong wind comes blowing in. And during this scary storm, they see something even scarier, an impossible sight. There is a man walking where people are not supposed to walk on the water. And they think it's a ghost, maybe the spirit of a dead fisherman lost at sea. So no wonder their first response is to freak out and be afraid. It's not a shock, is it? We're used to the predictable. Have you noticed that? We are so used to the predictable, in fact, that when God does something unpredictable, our response is often fear. This is classic in churches where we've done things a certain way for many, many years, and then a change comes and our response can automatically be negative because we think, this feels different, this feels wrong, this is in the wrong place, this makes me scared. And the disciples are afraid of this unpredictable moment here, but Jesus says, chill out, take courage, don't be afraid. And then Peter asks something totally unexpected. He says, command me to walk on the water. It's like he's saying, I want to go that too, I want to experience this. Peter already has this intuition, this kind of assumption that the power of Jesus can be transferred to his followers. That's pretty interesting. It shows great faith. So Peter says, tell me to come, command me to come, pretty much. And Jesus' response isn't so much a command, it's an invitation. Jesus says, come. And so Peter gets out of the boat, and in a masterclass of understatement, the text just says, Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water. And as long as Peter keeps his eyes on Jesus, he's okay. But if he starts to look down at the water and notice the wind, he sinks. Now, what does this tell us? Well, perhaps it's simply that as soon as we focus on ourselves, we start to see our flaws, our limitations. We start saying that we're not good enough or clever enough or holy enough to do the things we want to do. And this self-focus can actually end up sapping our faith. But the secret of water walking is, of course, to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. I think it's important to say something here, though, in the midst of all this. I don't think we should be looking down on Peter for his humanity here. In fact, I reckon the sinking part is perhaps the key teaching moment for us here. Imagine if Peter had just strolled out on the water without any weakness. We would have simply read this and thought, wow, Peter's a next level Christian. Can't ever be like that. But no, he falters. And we think, well, maybe he's just like us. You see, I think Jesus does call us sometimes to the very edge of our own resources, to a moment where we think, I can't do this. It's too much. It's too hard. And when we reach those sinking moments in our life where we feel overwhelmed and not in control, it's easy to think that those moments are signs of failure on our part. No. Actually, that moment of sinking or realization, I think, is a vital rite of passage for every Christian. For every person. It's good to have moments where we sink, when we realize that maybe this is too big for us. And by the way, if you haven't had any of these sorts of moments in your life before, when you feel out of your depth, then you might be tempted to feel that that must be a sign that you're doing everything right. You might think, I never feel like I'm sinking. I never feel like it's overwhelmed because unlike Peter, I trust in Jesus. Well, if that's true, great. But maybe you don't feel out of your comfort zone simply because you're always staying in the boat. You are resisting stepping out into new adventures, the likes of which can be scary and disorientating. Maybe you're letting adventure pass you by, but that's not Peter's approach. He chooses not to stay in the boat, but to step out of it. And with that comes a moment of being overwhelmed. It doesn't shame him, it elevates him. He reaches a better understanding of himself and of Jesus. Peter realizes that real breakthrough comes not by trying to generate our own miracles through our own strength and willpower, but the key is to focus on the miracle maker and to do things that are risky and things that are new. So he loses his focus for a moment and he sinks. Yeah. And Jesus says, you have little faith. And at first that sounds a bit harsh to our modern ears because we think that he's saying that Peter's a failure of faith. But no, that word faith unfortunately has baggage in our culture. Sometimes we think faith is about how we must build ourselves up and only if we get enough faith that somehow it will unlock a new level of breakthrough with God. Like God's work depends on our level of holiness and faith. We hear words like faith healing or where the faith of the person is the fuel for the miracle rather than God himself. But actually, one of the best ways of translating the original Greek words here for faith is actually the word trust or confidence. So Jesus is simply saying, oh man, why didn't you trust me? I had you. It would have been okay, Some of you are resisting stepping out to do new things, maybe even impossible looking things, because you think you have to be 100% full of faith and trust before you do it. That you think that you can only start a new venture or step out of the boat when you have certainty that it's God's will and that you won't sink. But if we think that, we're going to stay in the boat forever. Jesus uses this not as a chastising moment, I think, for Peter, but a teaching moment for all of us to say, look at yourself, you will sink. And even worse, stay in the boat and you'll miss out on adventure. But if you look at me, if you trust me, it's amazing what adventures you can potentially experience. And you don't have to wait till you brew up 100% faith. All you need is a mustard seed, and that can move a mountain or get your feet steady on water. And that's precisely the sort of faith that Peter shows here. A couple of years ago, I was in Rome. I was doing some research for a book I was writing, and I spent the day in the Vatican, which was an amazing experience, walking around the vast corridors packed with art. And one of the most impressive buildings in Vatican City is St. Peter's Basilica, which is perhaps the biggest church building I have ever stepped foot in. It is massive, right? It's so big. It kind of messes with your head, your perspective as you're walking around it, thinking this place is giant. And the Catholic tradition holds that this is the burial site of Peter, which is why so many popes have been interred there too. Now, whether Peter's actually buried there or not, that's actually not the point I want to make. The point for me is the respect and reverence that Christianity has for this man, Peter. The biggest tomb in the world has been built to honor an uneducated fisherman who has become distinctive and venerated by the church and the world. Why? Not because he was perfect, because he wasn't. Not because Peter never made mistakes, because he did, including deliberate ones like denying Jesus directly and lying about it after. And not because he was a man of constant 100% faith either, because he wasn't. We see this here. There were times he doubted, times he wasn't sure, times he took his eyes off Jesus and relied on himself, like we all do sometimes. But we honor Peter and we remember him and are inspired by him. Why? Because he was willing to step out of the boat. He was willing to fail publicly and willing to put a mustard seed of faith in Jesus. I wonder, what about you? Are you demoting yourself or feeling like you're not a good Christian because something you did, because you're doubtful about something, you're scared or unsure of things? It's okay to be that way. That's normal. It's human. But isn't it time you had a moment of water walking again, something new? Perhaps you have a sense of calling to try something different, something out of the ordinary. Maybe it's something that you have resisted doing because of what others might think or say. Maybe you assume that doing these new things will scare others in the same way as Jesus scared other people when he strutted about on the water, where he put himself somewhere he didn't belong. Or maybe you've put adventure off because you think it's impossible. And yet Peter shows us, with Jesus on the scene, even the craziest of things can be possible. Walking on water. Now, of course, it's not just Jesus saying that we must take this literally, and that the big miracle that we should all aim for is to go up as, Cotton End Baptist Church and walk on the river of Bedford, as cool as that would be. No, miracles and signs and wonders are supposed to be signs and wonders, like pointing to something bigger. I think Jesus is basically saying to us, this big teaching moment is that he has not built us to lounge forever in the safety of the boat, but instead he beckons us out on the water because that's where adventure lies. As crazy as it sounds, take courage. He's already out there. In whichever situation you might be thinking, Jesus is already out there holding his own on the choppy waters, and he says to you, come. He invites you into the adventure. We might think the point of this story, this big teaching moment Jesus was getting at, was basically to be in awe because Jesus walks on the water. That's an understandable reaction because it is amazing. But in some ways, the most mind-blowing part of this is that Peter walks on the water too, which means we can too, if we're willing to get out of the boat. Peter did that and became an inspiration for generations. You might be amazed at the impact you might have on the world when you say, the boat is not where I belong. My place is out there on the sea. Well, hey everybody, thanks for listening, and thanks for letting me slot into your video service. I hope you're all well, and look forward to seeing you face to face sometime. But until I see you again, take care and get ready to walk on water. Bye.